Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I welcome you to this evening's meeting, which is an opportunity to bring together, with the Bruges Group, members of Parliament and a group of leading city figures to discuss the great issues that we face today and the direction our country should take. Tonight we have on this platform three people who have immense experience, two of them so far, Tim's on his way, and are leaders in their field of expertise. Over their careers, lasting some 40 years or so, they have never been prepared to accept the prevailing orthodoxies of our times. So if you're looking for cosy consensus and establishment platitudes this evening, you will not be receiving them. Our first speaker is Terry Smith, who has had a long and successful city career. He has established a reputation for outstanding integrity, combined with the ability to create and successfully develop a range of city institutions. He began work with Barclays Bank in 1974. That must have been an interesting baptism. He became a stockbroker with W. Greenwell in 1984 and was rated the top banking analyst in London from 1984 to 1989. In 1990, he published the candid best-selling book, Accounting for Growth. It's a reflection of Terry's abilities that he could produce a best-selling book which had the word accounting in its title. Following publication, he left Phillips & Drew and joined Colin Stewart, becoming chief executive in the year 2000. In 2003, Colin Stewart acquired Tullett Liberty, the world's second largest inter-dealer broker. Terry is now chief executive of Tullett Prebon, and in 2010 he founded Fundsmith, of which he is the chief investment officer. He recently said, "We don't own bank shares and never will." Terry Smith has also led the campaign to commemorate Sir Keith Park, which culminated in the unveiling of his statue in Waterloo Place on the 70th anniversary of the Battle of Britain Day, the 15th of September 2010. In 2012's New Year's Honours List, Terry Smith was appointed a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Terry Smith.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those very kind words of introduction. I should probably provide a bit of elaboration on some of the background, just so that those of you who don't know me have one or two points of it clear. It is absolutely true that my book was a bestseller, even though it had accounting in the title. The fact that the investment bank I was working for sued me and tried to prevent publication probably had something to do with it. As others have found in the past, the best way to sell a book is if everybody tries to stop you publishing it. And so it did in fact knock Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time off number one. and it's slightly more understandable, I've got to tell you, if should you ever be inclined to think about reading it. Just in terms of my perspective, I think you've got most of what my background is there in terms of my perspective on this subject of Europe, Britain's place within it, the Eurozone and the economy, etc. By way of elaboration, Tullett Prebon, which I am now the chief executive of, the interdealer broker, for those of you who are not familiar with what that is, which I would imagine is almost all of you, I would think. An interdealer broker is a business which conducts the transactions between banks worldwide when they want to deal in things like bonds and foreign exchange and interest rates and so on, and is therefore at the centre of the world's money and capital markets. There are about 5 of them in the world, and not coincidentally, the 2 biggest ones happen to be headquartered here in London. Because London is indeed the centre of those markets in the world. It is the centre of the foreign exchange markets, the world's bond markets, and the world's markets in most of the products that banks deal in, basically. There was one other thing that didn't get mentioned in introduction that I should just tell you before I say anything more substantive, by way of putting my cards face up in front of you, which, as you said, I think is something that I generally like to feel I do. I ran for the referendum party in 1997. I stood for the referendum party. Given that it was, thank you. Given that it was Jimmy Goldsmith, we stood. We didn't run. Gentlemen don't run, as he was fond of telling me. And I suppose I'd start off with that, I suppose, as my sort of jumping off point into these remarks, because, of course, the referendum party, as the name implied, was about having a referendum. I'm told that we're going to have a referendum sometime after 2015, an in-out referendum on our membership of the European Union. Having been through this hoop before in 1997, frankly, I'll believe it when I see it, if and when I see it. Because it seems that people sometimes change their opinions on whether they're going to give us referendum or not. Of course, we have had a referendum before in 1975, and in reflecting upon that in the past, the things that have always struck me about it are several-fold. One is that we were quite clearly told at that time, I might say amongst other things, in a leaflet that was financed by the taxpayer extraordinarily for the Yes campaign, that, and I quote, "No important new policy can be decided in Brussels or anywhere else without the consent of a British minister answerable to a British government and British Parliament." That was clearly not true. So that, I say, combined with the fact that the majority of the electorate that's now able to vote have not had a say on whether or not we should be part of the EU alone, the change in our status relative to it and the change in the electorate would, for me, suggest that a referendum is something which we should have. But I have obviously believed that for some considerable time. Interestingly, in terms of campaigns for referendum, there are two things in life that I've agreed with Tony Benn about, which is extraordinary when you think about it. One of them was already mentioned. He was a vociferous supporter of the campaign to memorialise Sir Keith Park, the New Zealand airman who led 11 Group Fighter Command in the Battle of Britain. He wrote a piece for the Telegraph, which he co-authored with Lord Tebbit, which began with the sentence, "In 50 years in combined, 100 years in combined in politics, we've never agreed before," and then went on to support our campaign. He was, of course, also a supporter of the No campaign in 1975. So unusually I find myself in agreement with him, and of course in opposition to a number of people who are obviously part of the pro-Euro campaign, but more importantly, in looking at the way that they operate, they really do not want the electorate to have a say on this. And I'm thinking of things like quotes from Ken Clarke, who says that, and I quote, "We have to be careful with referenda because they're a gamble and the outcome is not certain." Yes, quite. Yes, quite. Yeah, that's what happens if you ask the people. They might occasionally tell you something that you don't want to hear, as has just happened in Italy, of course, where the EU appointed, self-appointed term, I love these self-appointed terms, technocrat, has been come forth, managing to come behind Silvio Berlusconi and a comedian, which seems to me to take quite a bit of doing in terms of rejection. I was speaking at an editorial intelligence, which strikes me as an oxymoron, by the way, an editorial intelligence conference a few weeks ago, was on the panel, and one of the questioners in the audience exemplified what I think the pro-Euro lobby's attitude is to the whole matter of the electorate referenda and so on. And his question to the panel was, does the panel think that there is a risk that if there is a referendum we'll leave the EU? To which my answer was, no, on the contrary, I think there's a risk we'll stay in. Which of course flabbergasted, because this is the way that the whole matter is used. So I think the most important thing to say in the first point, and I'll get back to it hopefully as my last point, is I am a believer in democracy, and it seems to me that there are many things about the way in which the EU operates and the people who are its supporters in the pro-lobby operate, which would suggest that they are not. Daniel Day-Lewis, of course, just won an Oscar for the third time, a record third time, for his appearance in the movie Lincoln. And I always hold true to a quote of Abraham Lincoln, which is, "I am a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts." I sent that out as my New Year's card, and it's something that I thoroughly believe in. I do not trust people who do not trust the people and the electorate to decide. On to hopefully the substance of the EU and the Euro entry. The other thing about it is when I hear people who oppose the position of thinking that one should be out of the EU, a couple of things strike me about it. One is This group of people, and I'm thinking now of people like Ken Clark and Richard Branson and Will Hutton and Niall Fitzgerald and Martin Sorrell and Howard Davis and so on, were all vociferous that we had to join the euro. And I've got quotes that I could give you, which I'm sure in any event are familiar to most of you, which I can go on endlessly about, but fortunately for you I won't, in which they made dire predictions about what would happen to the UK economy, what would happen to the City of London if we did not join the euro. And an equal number of quotes, I would say, which lauded the success of the euro. And what a wonderful thing it was, with I think the most recent one being as recent as 2010 from Will Hutton, that the euro might represent a safe place for us to retreat. I think some words to that effect. I wonder if they've thought of asking the population of Greece or Italy or Ireland or Portugal or Spain what their view is on this matter now. Because it seems to me, to some degree, somebody just did ask the population of Italy, and it didn't go well. So, you know, the reason I mention this is these people are basically will lead any campaign in the event that we do get a referendum in favour of us staying in the EU. In the industry that I've operated in for most of my working life in the city, whether as an analyst or now as a fund manager, if you get something as badly wrong as that, people are disinclined to listen to your opinion thereafter or trust you with their money. And rightly so, basically. So I do wonder whether any of them will ever pause and reflect upon how wrong they were on their views about the impact of the euro, both in itself and in terms of our absence from it for our country. I would like to think that they would, but it does seem to me that they're unlikely to do so. And it seems in their views on it, they basically come out with a lot of glib generalisations. They don't look at the facts, and I did spend some time as an analyst. I do like the facts, and one of the facts about the euro, and I'm not, by the way, to use the popular word at the moment, conflating or confusing the euro and the eurozone, the eurozone and the EU, but the two do have some fairly inextricable links, in my view. But just in talking about their opinions on the euro, it might have done well for them to have consulted the data from the World Economic Forum, who looked at groupings of countries in currency unions, either actual currency unions, ones that exist, ones that have existed, or ones that might exist, to compare a number of socio-economic and political factors to see whether the countries in those unions made them compatible. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this research, but they looked at a series of factors to see whether countries could stay together in a currency union. And they looked at, for example, the countries that had been in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the countries which had constituted the USSR and the Eastern Bloc, which had been in currency unions to some degree. They looked at the currency union of the United Kingdom. They looked at others which might have existed over time, for example, the countries of Central and South America, which one might think feasibly could be in a union, the countries of the Gulf states, the ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia, and so on. So they looked at all of those countries. They also, by way of control group, because it happened to give the same number of countries as there are in the Eurozone, they looked at a couple of control groups, and their control groups were all the countries in the world whose capital was within 5 degrees of the equator, and all of the countries in the world that began with the letter M, which is a pretty random grouping. I've got somewhere here the list of the countries. Oh, here we are. Macedonia, Madagascar, Malawi, Malaysia, the Maldives, Mali, Malta, the Marshall Islands, Mauritania, Mauritius, Mexico, Moldova, Monaco, Mongolia, Morocco, Mozambique, and Myanmar. That's the countries that begin with the letter M. Big pardon?
Macedonia is not a country.
Not a country. It's interesting that, yes. Yeah. I was wondering about it on the way through.
Macedonia is part of Greece.
Thank you. Yeah. But in any event, whether it is or it isn't, I can tell you this. Between that group of countries beginning with the letter M, the ones within 5 degrees of the equator, the former Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc., they could not find a set of countries with as diverse a set of socio-economic factors and political factors as the actual countries in the Eurozone. Now, that's of some significance in my view, because if you construct something which should never exist in the first place, it's quite likely to become dysfunctional. Or, to cut it more briefly, as it were, to cut it in terms of the Eurozone crisis, there is an old Indian proverb, which is, if you find yourself mounted on a dead horse, the best strategy is to dismount. So I suspect that our friends who will support the campaign to remain within the euro should reflect not just upon their previous forecasting record, but upon the facts, including whether Macedonia is a country. Thank you. We may have to find a different grouping of countries for them in future. The other thing that strikes me about the campaign is the misinformation which is passed out. I'm particularly struck when I look at there was a group of businessmen who were polled, and no less a person than Lord Mandelson, but also Roland Rudd, the PR man, and Chris Gibson-Smith, the chairman of London Stock Exchange, all quoted this as showing that 68% of businessmen were in favour of remaining within the EU. The actual number of people that they were quoting was 34. So one needs to be rather careful about disinformation. So I hope what I'll move on to now are a few facts. First of all, one of the things that people worry about in terms of any form of withdrawal by the UK from the EU is how we would trade with that group in future, and clearly the nature of our relationship with them in treaty terms is problematic, even though there are obviously international treaties in place which should make that transition viable. The devil is often in the detail. However, I don't fear that greatly. And the reason I don't fear that greatly is really quite simple. The EU has a positive balance of trade of £55.7 billion with the UK, so the likelihood that they're going to want to cease trading with us strikes me as very small. Notwithstanding their almost infinite capacity to cut off their nose to spite their face, they might actually spot this. For those who are in any way troubled by the concept of that, I always have a simple test, which is next time you're walking on a street in London, count the number of Audis, BMWs, Citroens, Fiats, Mercedes, Renaults, Skodas and VWs that you encounter, and next time you're in a major European capital, try and count the number of British cars and see how you get on. Now, admittedly, you have got to count some Japanese cars within the British now, because fortunately we do have transport factories which are producing here, but I think you'll find that that's one way of looking at it, or in the alternative, if you want to get the man in the back of the taxi's perspective on these matters, and it is his perspective that we need to bear in mind, I think, when we're addressing these things. Have a drive down the motorway to Dover and look what's coming the other way whilst you're doing it, whilst keeping your eyes obviously on the road to the necessary degree. And I think you'll conclude that that river is not something that the EU is going to be able or willing or want to stop. And so we will be able to negotiate, is my view on that. Turning to my own particular area, which is the city and financial services, as was rightly said in the introduction, I've worked within it for nearly 40 years now. It's a very important part of the UK economy, notwithstanding the problems which have appeared in the last 5 or 6 years within it, many of which are regrettable and require reform. There's no doubt about that, and I'm vociferous about that. I gave the annual Tacitus lecture at the Guildhall last year, and took as my title, Is Occupy Right? And notwithstanding the fact that it's impossible to answer that question because of the incoherence of what Occupy say, I used it as a jumping off point to say how much reform I thought was necessary within financial services. It is. Notwithstanding that, we need to bear in mind that this is actually a sector which provides 12% of the UK's tax revenue at least, probably quite a lot more if you take its indirect impact, I would suggest. It is the largest financial centre in the world. London has developed from being an entrepot for international trade in the physical sense into being an entrepot for international trade in the financial sense. And through it are conducted 4/5 of the financial services which take place within the EU. It is something, therefore, notwithstanding its need for reform, that I would have thought from the perspective of our country's employment, prosperity and taxation that we probably want to preserve. It is something that we need to preserve from the EU. The city, the financial markets are something which the EU both envies and fears. They envy it because they too would like to have a slice of that. They would like to have a portion of those jobs and those revenues that currently exist within the city, which is healthy. It's nice to have competition. I think competition is, in a free market, what makes us all better. So they do, but make no mistake, that is something which is envied. But it's also feared. And it's that bit that we need to be most careful about, which is the sort of action, if we remain within the EU, to which we may become subject, that could damage the city's standing in the world. And it does have a standing in the world. It is the biggest centre for the over-the-counter markets, the insurance markets in the world. And I give you as examples for that the the financial transaction tax, which is now being adopted in 11 EU countries. My company, Tullett Prebon, is the largest broker in European government bonds in the world. I might say a market which shows no signs of ceasing to grow as a result of their propensity to spend, I'm pleased to say. And as a result, we make revenues of a bit under £50 million a year in broking those bonds between various banks. £50 million is what they call in the neck of the woods where I grew up a lot of money, basically. So there we are. The financial transactions tax we compute, if it were applied to the underlying transactions which we're broking to our clients, would require them to pay over tax of about £600 million or 600 million euros. So in round number terms, you can see about 10 times the amount that we actually take out in brokerage. Now, fairly obviously, I would suggest to you, if our clients are subject to that kind of transaction tax, they will cease to trade in those bonds, either at all, or through us, or through London or anywhere in the EU. Clearly, where they have to do transactions, they will endeavour to continue doing so. And I would imagine if they can get outside that net, transacting those bargains in New York or Singapore will look incredibly attractive. Now, fortunately for us, we have offices in New York and Singapore, but it does mean that those revenues will be lost to London in those circumstances. And I think that's absolutely typical, and it should be shocking to consider the £50 million that we make in revenues against the approximately 600 million in euros that we contemplate that they will raise in taxation on this, because it tells you the scale of the taxation implied versus our actual transaction charge on these bargains. It is a multiple of the amount that's charged. And it brings me on to the remainder of my thoughts on the EU and the financial markets. Partly, of course, this is meant to raise revenue, I suppose, but the other thing is it's meant to prevent transactions. It's part of the developing theme of the so-called Tobin tax, that you throw a handful of grit into the markets to stop them transacting as much as they do. And frankly, I'm all in favour of not transacting as much as financial markets do. My fund, which I run, turned over 0.5% of its funds last year, which is a downright glacial movement of funds out there. So I'm not in favour of high-speed trading or speculative trading or a number of the things that people criticise. It's not particularly something I favour. However, I do think it is important that markets are allowed to freely trade in things including government bonds. And it needs to trade for two reasons. One is the provision of liquidity. People who hold those things occasionally need to sell them for various reasons and to be able to realise liquidity. And there's another important function of markets, and that's the price-setting function. The market is the meeting place of the willing buyer and the willing seller, whatever we're talking about, whether we're talking about a house or a car or a bond, and it's there that a price is set. And that is precisely what the members of the EU do not like about markets. Markets are the last thing that hold to account their extraordinary social experimentation and spending programs, basically. That's why they do not like markets. That's why I say they not only envy the City of London, but they also fear the City of London. If you have a look at the immediate reaction to the Italian election result, which of course was not the right election result, the immediate reaction was an announcement that the Italian regulator, the Consob, is thinking of stopping short selling and preventing the markets opining upon the outcome of that election, because they fear it. There's a wonderful quote which I like about the bond markets from James Carver, who was an advisor to Clinton, who said, "I used to think if there was reincarnation, well, I'd come back as the president or the pope or a .400 baseball hitter. But now I'd like to come back as the bond market. You can intimidate everybody." And he's absolutely right. What they fear about it is, as everybody who actually has plans to continue spending too much money, they fear the pronouncement on their plans of the people who are lending them the money, the markets. And that's amongst the many reasons why we have to keep the City of London out of the clutches of the EU over time. So that's where I think my view is from sitting in the City of London, running one of the businesses in there. It's not a piece of special pleading for my business, which people may paint it as. If as a result of the EU reforms, and I use that term obviously in parentheses, as it were, but if as a result of the EU reforms, Tullett Prebon ceases to exist, the world will still keep spinning, I'm pretty sure. Actually, I think as a result of the EU reforms, Tullett Prebon won't cease to exist. It may just actually do rather more business in Singapore and New York than it does in London, which I think is a more likely outcome. The more important thing is what it will do to the totality of the city and its impact on the UK economy and the ability of markets to hold the EU to account for its plans. So I actually think if you look at the membership of the EU, struggling to be in the EU is a rather interesting concept, in my view, because it strikes me as being wishing to remain as part of the least competitive trading bloc in the world. If we compare the EU with any other major trading bloc, if we compare it with actual trading blocs out there, such as the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement countries, or the countries of ASEAN, or China, or India, it is, on any measure that you wish to compute, the least competitive place in the world to do business. Why are we struggling to remain a member? It's really something that I find very, very difficult to figure out. Obviously, everything I've said so far pretty much has been about the impact of the EU on the City of London, financial services, and so on. But I'd like to finish with one other thing. I realise that the sort of topic tonight that I was given was the EU and the economy. But I was on a Newsnight programme recently, and it was a debate about the EU referendum. And one of the members of my side of the studio was a woman called Hella Hagenau, who turns out to be the General Secretary of an organisation called No to EU in Norway. And in the course of the debate, which 95% of which was about the balance of trade with the EU and whether we could survive with that balance of trade in the event that we weren't a member, and so on and so forth, she made a very important point. She said, you've all been talking about the economy. Politics does matter. People have a right to be governed in the way that they wish to be governed, even if there is an economic cost to that. And I think that is a very important point. There's a quote from Roland Rudd, who of course is one of the staunch supporters of the Pro campaign, that says, the problem with this debate is too many people think about politics and not the economy. I think that's exactly the wrong way around. And she made a very important point there. It is our right to be governed with sovereignty in the way that we wish to be governed, even if there is an economic cost to that. Although my personal view is that the economic cost is in fact the other way around. The cost is as a result of us being a member of this uncompetitive trading bloc and the damage which I think it will do to our financial services. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Terry, for those unique insights. We now have the pleasure of hearing from two of the UK's top economists. Firstly, Tim Congdon, who is a member of the Bruges Group Academic Advisory Council. He's also served as one of the Chancellors of the Exchequer's Six Wise Men and was awarded a CBE for services to the economic debate in 1997. Tim is a prolific writer. Among his publications are The City of London Under Threat, The EU and Its Attack on Britain's Most Successful Industry, published by the Bruges Group. And in the last 12 months he has published How Much Does the European Union Cost Britain? Answer, approximately 10% of GDP, around £150 billion per annum. And out this week there is the publication Europe Doesn't Work, a discussion of the 3 million jobs at risk lie and related misconceptions. He has also managed to produce a major work entitled Money in a Free Society, Keynes, Friedman, and the New Crisis in Capitalism. Tim's analysis of Britain's economic issues has been first class over a period of nearly 40 years, since he started as a journalist at the Times as a leading critic of Edwards Heath's Dash for Growth. He has quite simply been on the right side of nearly every major economic issue that the British government has faced during that period. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Congdon.
evening we're talking about the EU, the British economy and the City of London. Three very big topics in their own right. I'm going to be tackling them, may seem rather indirectly, and indeed I want to start with the Stone Age. Let's take us back a few tens of thousands of years and think about how we organise our lives. Of course, we can try and do everything ourselves. We can grow our own food, we can sew our own clothes, we can build our own houses, and so on. No specialisation. It's going to be very poor, as of course people were in the Stone Age. Or we can start to specialise. And even in the Stone Age they had flint mines, and I suppose they even had flint traders, and so there was something like the City of London even tens of thousands of years ago. And specialisation leads to growth. It's specialisation that has led to modern civilization, and so on. How did people specialise? Now, I'm sitting on a panel this evening with, I suppose I'm a city entrepreneur too, but they're far more successful than me, I can tell you. 3 city entrepreneurs. And let me tell you that everybody in this panel could do the job of our secretaries far better than they could. You really could. No doubt about that at all. But the point is that our time is much more effectively used, talking to clients, doing research and so on. Our advantage there is so much greater that it makes sense for us to employ secretaries to reduce the amount of time that we have to do for those things, and that means we can specialise what we're really good at. And the same thing is true of nations. And let's just be clear that in Britain we only have about 1% of the world's population. So we have to specialise. But Britain's a rather unusual nation because we pioneered the Industrial Revolution. And there was a time when Britain produced most of the world's cotton textiles, most of its coal, most of its steel, most of its iron, and a whole mass of other products as well. And what this has led to is a nostalgia for manufacturing in our country. And the view about the British economy that we should specialise always on manufacturing, because that is our, if you like, our trademark, our history, and so on. We should actually specialise according to comparative advantage. That's what economic theory tells us. That's what Adam Smith and David Ricardo explained over 150 years ago. We 3 gentlemen on this platform were specialised according to comparative advantage. We have secretaries do things for us. We don't have the really low productivity, it's given somebody else. Now look, I come back to Britain and this question of rebalancing and what we do in the next few years and what that means for economic policy and the EU. In 1948, I just checked the figures today, Britain's exports of goods, in those days virtually all manufactured goods, were about 15% of GDP, and their exports of services about 4% of GDP. Today, the figures are that exports of goods have risen a bit, they're about 20% of GDP, and exports of services are 12% of GDP. Relative to GDP, exports of goods have risen a third, exports of services have trebled. I put it to you that what these numbers suggest is that what we are good at, in the sense of what we have a comparative advantage at, is services. I may also just make absolutely clear I'm not in favour of government policy discriminating against manufacturing or discriminating in favour of services. I just put it to you what the data suggests is what we're good at is services. Think about a factory, a manufacturing company. That the people on the shop floor, they're not the best paid people. The people who are well paid are the people doing the designing, the marketing, the legal work, the financial work. And actually, as a nation, that, on this basis, the service part of the enterprise, that's where we should be specialising. Now, what we see at the moment in this country is, to my mind, an appalling attack on what clearly comes out of the numbers, that we're good at services, all right? And what you have is a number of themes in public debate and public policy making. One of which is that we're too dependent on the City of London. I mean, I couldn't care less about where our exports come from. It's a question of what are we good at doing, and the data are pretty clear we're good at. Terry spoke about his company with sales of £15 million, and bless you, that's fantastic. Britain's exports of financial services are about £50 billion, all right? Very big part of our economy. Our exports of international business services in the large, which includes what lawyers do, what accountants do, and so on, is about getting on for 120, 130 billion pounds. About 8% of our national product, produced by about 4% of our people. We have the argument that we should devalue in order to promote manufacturing. We'll have a further discussion about this. I'm not sure Roger agrees with me. As far as I'm concerned, trying to cheapen your currency is not a way to economic success, and in any case, if it's intended to divert our economy to rebalance towards manufacturing, it's a misjudgment anyway. What we also see is, members of the European Union, we're seeing attacks on our pattern of specialisation as a nation from the European Union. Barry very kindly referred to the pamphlet I wrote at the Bruges Group 3 years ago, and thank you, Raj, and I wish I had time to do, and I will do another, don't worry, but been promising one for 2 or 3 years now, another copy of that. That was actually prepared before the Lisbon Treaty had come into effect, before in fact the British government had gone along with it. And now I concluded critically we must avoid signing the Lisbon Treaty, because the Lisbon Treaty would transfer control of financial regulation to the continent. I don't mind the continent. There's wonderful people there. However, the European Union is not friendly to Britain in our service sector. It's not friendly to the City of London. At that point, what we were really worrying about most of all was various things, but it was the AIFMD, the Alternative Investment Fund Management Directive, has gone through, our government has signed the Lisbon Treaty, the AIFMD has gone through, it is increasing costs for investment trusts. Investment trusts have been in Britain, started off in Scotland, have been in Britain for over 150 years. They're having higher costs because of that. Hedge funds are having to alter their operations because of that, and so on. But since then, the Lisbon Treaty has been passed. We've had the financial transfers tax, financial transactions tax being proposed. Ruinous effect on our economy. The City of London, our exports of financial services rose incredibly by 15% a year for about 25 years. A fantastic growth industry. Of course they were jealous, and I'm afraid that they too want to attack it. And now we might do another. Well, I know there are probably people who think that what goes on in the city is wicked and the rest of it, and it's a very serious offence to be successful in life and make a lot of money, isn't it? That's a very wicked thing to be. And so we now get this attack on the amount of incomes that can be paid out in our country by a foreign bureaucracy. The tax on city bonuses and so on. There's an awful lot to say. All I would say is that our membership of the European Union is making us poorer. That's obvious. It's obvious. There's no doubt about it at all. There is a direct threat to the success of our most dynamic, rapidly growing, most productive industry, civil industries, which is in London. It's clearly happening, but not just the city. They also want to attack the accounting industry. I dare say things are wrong with the accounting industry, but that also is one in which Britain excels. Membership of the EU is therefore very bad for our economy. It's also making us less free, various attacks on fundamental civil rights and so on. So, when we talk about the EU, the British economy, the City of London, started in 2013, my conclusion is very simple, that we should leave the European Union. And may I just say that I'm quite optimistic that I don't think it's going to be tomorrow night or on Friday morning, we're going to see the people of Eastleigh and Hampshire share that view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. Our next speaker is Roger Bootle, who is one of the City of London's best-known economists. As well as running Capital Economics, which he founded in 1999, Roger is also a specialist advisor to the House of Commons Treasury Select Committee and an honorary fellow of the Institute of Actuaries. He was formerly Group Chief Economist of HSBC, and like Tim, was one of the panel of 6 wise men during the Major government. In 2012, Roger and his team won the Wolfson Prize. I think it was a sum of some £250,000, and it's the second biggest prize in economics after the Nobel Prize. It was, of course, about how one could organise an orderly breakup of the Eurozone. And if you hear Roger's mobile ringing at all while he's speaking, it may be Mario Draghi trying to get through. Roger has written several books on monetary economics, including The Trouble with Markets, Money for Nothing, and The Death of Inflation, the latter of which he was much criticised from at the time, but you usually are if you get things right. Roger is also a regular columnist for the Daily Telegraph. He consistently argues his own coherent point of view, and in the Comment Awards for 2012, he was named the Economic Commentator of the Year. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Roger Bootle.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be asked to speak to you here tonight on this fascinating topic. You heard earlier on from Terry about his book, not only from Terry, actually also from the chairman, Accounting for Growth, and it's a wonderful story that it was attempted to be banned or it was going to be sued or whatever. Sadly, I've never been that privileged in relation to my books. They've all, I suppose, sunk without trace in some sense, in particular index-linked gilts. No one tried to ban that. At one point, I think it was going to be in danger of being prescribed on the NHS as a cure for insomnia. But anyway, now in the title this evening, there is, of course, particular mention of the city. I'm not going to concentrate my remarks on the city because I think this is only actually just a special case of a more general phenomenon. Tim has talked quite a lot about it, and Terry has as well, and no doubt we'll talk later about it. I'm going to concentrate more generally on the economic and political principles behind the idea of the EU and behind the idea of our membership of it. Why would you want to be a member of a trade bloc? Well, I think the answer depends, and this is very far from being original, on the potential extent of the gains from trade creation between the members of the bloc against trade diversion, that's to say the diversion of trade with the rest of the world. And in principle, it's possible to imagine membership of trade blocs which will bring you actually net loss, and indeed many have. Some people might think that the EU does directly from that particular factor. You'd look at that, and you'd look also at the extent to which this bloc tried to interfere in all sorts of economic activities that you had in your country that had nothing whatever to do with trade. And on the basis of those considerations, you'd come to some overall assessment. And the assessment would depend a lot upon how successful that trade bloc was, both in relation to trade and in economic issues more generally. I'll come back to that in a moment. Why would you want to belong to a political association, whether it's the same countries as the trade bloc or some other grouping? Well, surely it would be because you wanted to benefit from the efficient and effective decisions that you might make or might be made for you as a result of membership of that bloc, and or fear of what might happen to you with regard to decisions that will be made by that bloc if you were not a member of it. And again, that balance is going to depend a lot on just how good that grouping is at making good decisions, and of course how big and important and successful it is in relation to the rest of the world. Now, I think all three members of this panel have spent quite a lot of their time studying history in some respect. I think we all have a great deal of respect for historical judgment and what it can bring, the perspective it can bring to current issues. I reflect a lot on the way the EU emerged and on the particular historical circumstances that gave rise to the ideas behind it, and the ideas which still, I think, inform so many of the supporters of continued EU membership. But what strikes me is the remarkable contrast between the world, the nature of the world in which the EU was born, and the nature of the world in which we live today. When the EU was first established, of course it wasn't called the EU, you recall, we referred to it as the Common Market, and it went through a series of changes of names, but in essence it's the same organisation. When the EU was established, the world was dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. The emerging markets, by contrast, were a mere pipe dream. What's more, this was before the advent or development of what you might term the European demographic time bomb. The idea that at that point the European population would, in many European countries, actually be contracting was not something that you would have readily imagined. That was the world into which the EU emerged. The truth of the matter now is that the EU is in very steep relative economic decline. And it's in steep relative economic decline for two reasons. First of all, it's the demographic one that I've mentioned earlier, and that's set remarkably to carry on for decades. Population set to fall in Germany, Spain and Italy. France is a bit different, but German population set to decline quite sharply. But over and above that, of course, a poor productivity performance. Put those two things together and compare them with what's going on in large parts of the world. The United States, not spectacular, but actually pretty good, and you're seeing already doing a reasonable job of crawling out of the difficulties that it's in. Asia continuing to grow quite strongly. Bits of the Middle East doing well. Even Africa now starting to improve its act a bit, and Latin America as well. Now, I don't think it's actually widely appreciated. In fact, I know it's not widely appreciated by the British people that the EU is, at the moment, a relative economic failure. It's not widely appreciated by politicians either, and certainly not by the media. And again, I think you have to interpret this and explain it historically. What people are reacting to is often the level, apparent level of GDP or consumption in many of these European countries, which is still very high, and it's high as a result of some fantastic rates of economic growth that these countries enjoyed, many of them, in the years and decades after the war. That gave rise to a sense of British inferiority and helped to impel us towards joining the EU. But I think also there's a general sense of British inferiority, in particular with regard to the Germans, what I call the Vorsprung durch Technik syndrome, a widespread feeling that, they're simply wonderful and we are dreadful. And recent economic performance over the last couple of decades simply do not bear this out. Britain has outgrown Germany by a considerable margin. It's also outgrown France. It's outgrown, of course, the weaker countries of the periphery. And poor dear old Italy, of whom I'm a great lover, the problem with Italy, of course, is it didn't have any growth even in the boom years. And then when things went wrong, we all know the story. So you might want to join a trade unit if it was big and successful and dynamic, and at one point the EU looked to be exactly that. Unfortunately, at the moment, it looks to be exactly the opposite. This echoes what Terry was saying earlier on. It's in steep relative decline, and that relative decline is set to continue. Now, what about the political dimension? Well, the EU is a byword for taking chronically awful decisions with regard to almost any issue that's put before it. Be it agriculture, fisheries, defence, currency, virtually anything. It makes a Horlicks of it. This is not accidental. It's quite systematic. And the reason is, and this has been touched on to some extent already, the appalling nature of European institutions. This is a very badly crafted union indeed. There is a very severe democratic deficit. On top of that, the EU is massively corrupt. When decisions are made, they're made as a result of a ghastly horse trading process between what we can still just about call sovereign states. And over and above that, the prevailing drive towards ever closer union is bound to bring an excessive emphasis on harmonisation, which of course means regulation and interference. It can't mean anything else because people don't start off harmonised, and so you end up with an anti-business and statist bias. So political association, well, this is, the record shows it, but also when you analyse the nature of the thing which you are politically associated with, it's quite clear this is a body which is systematically unlikely to make good decisions on almost any issue. And as regards interference in the economy and society, well, we know, and Tim and Terry have already touched on this, this is an entity, for the reasons that I've given, which wants to reach its tentacles ever deeper into every nook and cranny of our life, and that's going to continue. Changing gear a bit, where does prosperity come from? I think the trouble is our politicians, and apologies to the politicians who are here tonight, including Tim, because they're obviously an exception to this. So many politicians think that prosperity emerges from treaties, votes, agreements and resolutions. It does not. It emerges from the hard work of millions of ordinary people. That's not to say that the politicians don't matter. They most certainly do, because they can stop those millions of people from working effectively, making good decisions and producing wealth and prosperity. The capacity for actually putting a spanner in the works is enormous. Good governance really, really matters. It's the key to economic success. And one of the prime examples of this in the world, I think, is Singapore, which has had the most remarkable success story over the last several decades. There are things I don't like about Singapore, but I do very much admire what the government of Singapore has achieved for its people. So many British leaders simply don't seem to understand the wellsprings of prosperity. I've already mentioned Singapore. I not long ago read Lee Kuan Yew's autobiography, and a fascinating book it is. One particular telling bit is when he refers to the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference presided over by Harold Macmillan, where he announced that Britain was going to apply to join what was then the Common Market. I can't remember which particular date it was, 61, 62 or somewhere around that point. Lee Kuan Yew says, of course, with some considerable amusement, that Harold Macmillan breezed in and very airily said something to the effect, "I'm terribly sorry, old chaps, but you know Britain's got to sever its traditional ties with all of you, because it's quite clear that in the modern world a country can only succeed by being a member of a huge trade bloc on its doorstep." And that is quoted by the man that was the Premier of Singapore, who led a country out of an island swamp to a level of living standards higher than Britain without being a member of any trade bloc whatsoever, never mind on its doorstep. Now, how was it that Britain made such a chronic mistake as this? Well, there were all sorts of reasons, but dare I say it, one of them, we've heard something about the British strengths from Tim, and I very much concur with what he said. We do have a few weaknesses too, you know. One of the weaknesses is I think we've got this awful inclination to think that the solution to any old problem is to join a club. And we want to find, we want to get it feels cosier. I think some of this is to do with the legacy of empire. This notion that somehow or other we've got to really walk around with a big stick, be a member of a big organisation. And our diplomatic corps is particularly inclined to this. It's what I call top table syndrome. We've got to be at the top table. Why? I don't care which table we're at. Let these people sit at the back of the room. Do some work for a change to earn their money. there's nothing wrong with being a medium-sized, successful, hard-nosed country. That's what I want Britain to be. That's what I think it can be. It doesn't need to be the member of some cosy club. Now, I turn briefly and quickly to the city. I do so in this context. A lot of city people, good people, clever people, are worried that outside the EU the city would suffer. I understand this. They worried that we could be discriminated against, that the powers that be on the continent would make a serious effort to get business away from London. I think they're right to be worried about this. I don't, however, agree with their judgment, because what they're missing is that those powers that be on the continent are going to be trying to do that anyway if we are inside the EU. That's exactly what they want. And our powers to influence and stop that process inside the EU are getting smaller and smaller by the year, and I don't think we are going to be able to withstand it. Outside the EU, I think we'd be in a stronger position, not least because the city's main market has got to be the world outside, which is getting bigger and bigger in relation to the world inside the EU. And in any case, their ability to build up Frankfurt and Paris to rival London, I think, is, well, it's pie in the sky. Terry correctly referred to the debates about the euro some years ago, and I well remember all those people, that gallery of rogues, then arguing that outside the euro, the city of London would collapse, all this business would concentrate on Frankfurt and Paris. I remember all the arguments. And of course it was complete and utter tosh. The city gained. I think there would potentially be a difficult few years actually for the city, but I do imagine that if we left the EU, we would see the French in particular making some serious efforts to exclude us and to penalise institutions that continue to deal extensively through London. But I don't think they'd be that successful. I'm pretty sure they wouldn't be successful in building up Paris and Frankfurt. If they build up anywhere, it would probably be Zurich, Singapore and New York. Now, as I referred earlier on to these appalling decisions in the past, and I talked about Harold Macmillan, we do have a vein in our history, I think, of these periods of great weakness when we're inclined to make these terrible decisions, not realising our own strengths and not taking the appropriate long view. That was such an occasion, and I'm worried about it now. The truth of the matter, though, is that I think developments in the world economy and technological developments very much play to Britain's traditional strengths. The idea of being a global trading power, that's exactly congruent with the world as it's developing. It seems to me particularly ironic when you think about what people argue on the other side of this debate about Britain not just joining the euro but being happy to submit to political union, all that other stuff. It seems to be deeply ironic when you consider our history. This is a country which, in the age when distance really mattered before modern communications, this is a country which cast its net and its ambitions across the globe and built up a global empire. What a strange idea that this country, in the age when distance doesn't really matter, might decide that it somehow or other got to do the economic and political equivalent of marrying its next door neighbour. This seems to me to be utterly bizarre, to completely fly in the face of history. This is an age when we should be free, an age above all, to make political associations not on the basis of geographical proximity, but rather fellow feeling, law and history, and common shared institutions and attitudes, as we once did in the age when distance really mattered. So let me sum up. I think quite simply the EU pulls off a remarkable feat. It manages to be both too small and too large at the same time. It's too large to be an effective political unit, and it's much too small to be a single integrated economic unit on which to base one's trade. Because the only unit that makes any sense for that is, of course, the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Roger. I'll now take some questions. Okay. Gentleman in the middle row, holding up the Bruges Group publication.
Thank you, Robinson from Nottingham. I'm quoting from your book, Saying No to the Single Market, Professor Jean-Jacques Rosa, Frenchman by the way. He said, what are the reasons for the dogged pursuit of a centralising strategy, i.e. ever closer integration? And he answered the question, because of the huge benefits to the centralised European regulators and, subject to my question, the profits from business interest groups and oligopolies. In other words, large producers or suppliers who can gain control over the supply of commodities and influence their prices. Is this why the big members, I think the number of 34 people consulted was mentioned earlier by one, is this why the big companies, and maybe the big banks, is this why they say we should stay in the European Union? Because that is bad for the small and medium enterprises, which are, after all, they are the core of our business, not the big firms.
I think you may have a point, sir. Terry, would you like to comment on this?
Just to comment on that. I think you have got a good point. The fact is that big business is much better able to survive in a world of high regulation than the small to medium enterprise, and that's why they basically are likely to be greater supporters of this. So I think your point is correct.
Okay, I'll take another question. Gentleman down at the bottom of the gangway in the yellow tie. Yes, sir.
Roger Kendrick. I take Tim's point about comparative advantage in the city, and we should exploit that advantage. But the city used to do something else, and that is it used to finance the rest of the British industry. And we've heard today from Tim that we've got all these fund management businesses that shovel money backwards and forwards between themselves and take management fees and all the rest of it. But there's very little happening in the city to actually fund the rest of the country, either commercially or industrially. And I think if we're going to make progress in this country and grow and be successful, then the city needs to remember what it was originally set up for, and that is to fund British industry and British commerce, and continue to trade internationally and all the rest of it, but don't forget the rest of it.
Thank you very much for that question. Before I turn to Tim, I'll just have a word from Terry, who's actually been involved in quite a bit of funding over 40 years.
Yes, one way or another, raising funds for various companies across a wide range of industries, including myself from time to time. Yes, it's a good point. I suppose the most important thing perhaps to say about it is an element of the city has got away from, it's a banker, a Scottish banker no less, a friend of mine recently, a somewhat discredited species these days, but nonetheless there are some good ones left, said to me the other day, and he was referring to banks, which is obviously a part of what you're referring to. He said, what we need to get back to is the day when banks dealt with their customers rather than with each other. And you're quite right, a very large part of what the city does has become about people dealing with each other in esoteric instruments or about high frequency trading. Getting back to a world where people actually really wanted to own a piece of a business or lend to that particular business and were willing to sit there and both sides worry about the outcome is a very important part of it, I agree. Although I would say I don't think it's just the UK, although I see finance in the UK is right. I'm taking on the points that were made by Roger in particular. I think we should be doing it for the world, and I think we're quite capable of doing it for the world. But it does require people to get back to a focus where when they're managing funds, they actually really want to own a piece of a business. They don't want to own it for 11 seconds before they sell it to somebody else. And when they're a bank, they lend the money, and then when they've lent the money, both the bank and the borrower sit there and worry about it until it's repaid. That's what we need to get back to.
Tim, do you want to comment on this point?
Okay, yeah.
Would you like the mic? Hand you the baton.
Okay, I could spend a couple of hours on this question. It's very important to realise that the city is very diverse, and what you're really talking about, I think, is the banking system. Just particularly, by the way, of the City of London. I mean, there are banks all over Britain, and they take deposits from all parts of Britain and so on, and they lend to all parts of Britain. What's gone wrong with the banks is partly their own fault, but I'd say it's also that in 2008 there was a drastic tightening of regulation, sharp increases in capital asset ratios, restrictions on interbank funding. I have less qualms about that than you, Terry, by the way, but still curious given the business you're in. The banks also required to hold much safer assets, including government securities, which meant that they could lend less to. And the credit drought is, in my view, largely to be blamed on officialdom in this country, not on the city. Now, you can discuss and debate that, but in my view, that fundamental cause of what you're complaining about is not the banks particularly, it's not the city. Can I just, before I finish, because there's an awful lot to say. The city today is predominantly, you're quite correct, it's predominantly serving international business. As I say, it's a huge exporter, essentially providing a range of often rather complex services to big multinationals and so on. And some of the products are very complex and difficult. It's one of the reasons they're very highly paid. This is not something we should be ashamed of. It's something that we should be very proud of. That, that when these very complex transactions, also huge volumes of transactions requiring computer backup and so on, that this happens in our capital city and generates very large incomes. We're providing these services to businesses all around the world, to pick up Roger's point. And for the European Union to attack this industry is a disgrace, and we must resist that. Okay? Whatever you feel, and I don't agree with the idea that the reason for the credit drought actually is it's predominantly because of mistakes actually by the Bank of England, the FSA, the Treasury, and so on. Having said that, we must resist the attack on our most successful industry by the foreign bureaucracy in Brussels.
Thank you. I'll take a question now from Bill Casham. Bill?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's been a fascinating trilogy, if that's the right word for it. Very, very interesting and up to date. Thank you very much indeed. Terry asked the question to begin with, are they facing the facts? Well, the answer we hear is not. They are not facing the facts. And there are those of us who set out these arguments back in the days of Maastricht. Nothing's changed. The predictions, the analysis, the fact that European government was now going to take over, that monetary union would collapse, that would be followed by riots and unemployment, and the rise of the far right, have all happened. The advantage we have now is that we can actually look at what is going on, as Terry and Roger and Tim have explained, in Italy and in Spain and in Greece, etc. And what is absolutely astonishing, and this is really what I wanted to say, is that given the fact that everything has happened as was thought would happen, they're still not taking the blindest notice. That is the problem. I just want to mention the Barroso blueprint, which actually says, and this is not just a bit of paper, this is the mechanism whereby they're going to force feed all the countries of Europe with more instability in apparently seeking to achieve the stability that has already eluded them. Now, what it says is the European Parliament is the only parliament for the European Union. In other words, forget this room here, forget the House of Commons, which is basically where, for example, with regard to the people of this country, they cast their votes in general elections, which should enable them to be able to decide what kind of government they want, Terry. Not this European government, Roger, as you quite rightly pointed out. And what this actually is also about, if I may just say this, is that this is driven by a doctrine. It is an ideology. And the ideology from the beginning, and Roger referred to the early history, is with respect to the manner in which they decided that what they wanted was to have a political union. That was the beginning of it, and that is where they are still going, despite the evidence against it. So it is an attack on freedom of choice. It's freedom of choice in the ballot box they're attacking. It is freedom of choice in the marketplace, and it is freedom of choice in financial services in the City of London. In fact, it is an attack on competition as well. So in a nutshell, what we're now faced with is the necessity to fight this with everything at our disposal. We have to do it, if I may say to all of us here in this place in Parliament, because this is the only place in which it's going to be done. And I'll end with one last comment, and that is this, that the European Communities Act is a voluntary act of Parliament that was decided upon, as you quite rightly pointed out, Roger, when Harold Macmillan made the decision. It was in the 60s, but it developed through Heath into the 72 Act. But it remains a voluntary act. And it is up to us in this place to make sure that we restore to the British people the right, first of all, to govern themselves, and secondly, to see that the decisions that are taken when they vote in the ballot box actually happen and not overridden by people who get everything wrong.
I wanted just briefly to comment on that. I very much agree with what Bill Cash said, but I've got a few things to say. First of all, I think looking back over the last few generations, certainly true of my own family, there are a number of events, major issues in history that have impinged very much on individual lives, and it's meant all sorts of things, serious things have happened which have needed a struggle from the individuals to oppose. And I think this European issue is the great issue of our day. And if we get it wrong, the consequences are going to be dire. It is the equivalent of the issue to do with fascism in the 1930s and the opposition to communism later on. It really is that big. Now, I very much agree with what you said, Bill Cash, about it's remarkable how, as far as the European establishment's concerned, their intellectual confidence, I don't think, has been knocked at all by what's happened. They're just carrying on steamroller-like. In this regard, the euro, which is actually potentially, analytically anyway, separable from the future of the EU, I think really isn't. If we get some fracturing of the euro, and I still do think we will, I think that will deliver a very, very serious blow to this whole project. Having said I agree with you, I'm a bit more optimistic than what you seem to be in what you said, because let's not forget how far we've come. It's true, I think, that German politics, to me anyway, remains a complete mystery. I don't understand why no German politician has seized the apparent opportunity to call for a dismantling of the euro. No major German politician has done it. But let's look at the rest of Europe. I think things have come a very long way. We've got strong Eurosceptic parties in Finland, in Holland. We've got a strong Eurosceptic tinge now in France. And of course, we know that in Italy, the voters can't quite decide which clown they want, namely a retired professional one or a still acting amateur one, but they do seem to have said they're not that keen on actually more austerity in the euro. So I think we've actually come quite a long way. My guess is it's not going to take that much more pressure for actually the elites to have to respond.
Yes. No. You want to go for another question?
We'll go to Tim on this. I think Tim's got a few comments.
I wanted to pick up actually on Bill's question, which is that this puzzle of people in top positions just being wrong, and not seeing that they're wrong, and appearing to have the support of lots of clever people in universities and so on, and also then of millions of people who vote for them in elections. We mustn't forget that in the 20th century we had millions and millions of people, including millions of people in our own country, totally deluded by communism.
Yep.
And, the 1930s was generally believed in Britain that there was rapid economic growth in the Soviet Union, that communism was outperforming capitalism. People, millions of people in Britain believed that right through to the 1960s and 1970s. People like Jim Callaghan, our Prime Minister, said that in Eastern Europe they've got faster economic growth than us, and you have to learn from them. So there's nothing really new here, but it's a great puzzle. And I'm trying to explain this, and it's obviously tied up kind of, why do people, I'm some people are about to say, it's tied up, why do people believe religions? These are kind of religions, these things.
Yeah.
And I don't quite, but there will be a moment when it suddenly dawns on that this is a terrible mistake. Obviously, I believe in some kind of things that are, if you wish, semi-religious, like the rule of law and free trade and all those kind of things. But I don't. But I think that's reasons to believe in. The evidence that the European Union is failing and so on is surely very clear. But the European Commission keeps on churning out propaganda. Can I just finish by saying that I gather that in our schools at the moment there's being circulated a pamphlet paid for by the European Commission. A pamphlet talking about the first 10 years of the euro and saying 10 success stories. They're going through the success stories. Yes, this is going around our schools. Now, I know children are not that stupid. I'm sure many of them are laughing as well. But having said that, evidently people paid for by the European Commission wrote this stuff down, paid for. I mean, just appalling.
Terry, would you?
I'll be very brief to finalise the comment on Bill's point. I think you've actually got to the point of explaining it to a considerable degree. The reason why we were frightened of the Soviet Union and its military might and people lauded its economic performance when we had a country that couldn't actually give people a refrigerator or a decent car and whose submarines only killed Soviet sailors, so there wasn't much chance of them killing anybody else, was because the one thing that regimes of this sort are good at is propaganda. Yeah. The production of disinformation is in fact their greatest product. That's what we're looking at.
Excellent point. I'll take a question from David Campbell-Bannon.
Well, can I just congratulate you, the Bruges Group, for such a fantastic high-powered panel as we have tonight, first of all. There are three statistics that hit me when we talk about the economy. The first one is that the EU's share of world GDP is falling from 36% in 1980 to a forecast 12% in 2020. And I think that sets all of this into context. Also, another statistic is that only 10% of our economy is trade with the EU, and actually that's fallen as a percentage. 10% of the economy, not half of our trade, but 10% of the economy. And the other fact is that £3 billion a month is being imported that's the net figure, the deficit from the EU a month, £3 billion a month more than we export to it. So I think this really sets the whole debate in context. But the question I have to ask is this. I mean, I voted personally against the Fund Managers Directive for you, but there's 49 pieces of EU legislation in this area of financial services. It's causing massive damage to the City of London. What I don't understand is why the City of London isn't fighting harder against this and saying, look, we really are now at a point where it's either the City of London or the European Union, and I would choose the City every day.
I think this is a question that baffles a lot of us. Why isn't the City of London fighting harder?
Yes, I think it comes back to something which was touched upon earlier, which is what is the City of London in this regard. And I think the voices that you hear from the City of London representing it in matters like this quite often are people who are at the head of major banks, for example, large multinational corporations who actually do see their future as part of such a combination and their ability to be able to cope with this. If you look back over the development of the city for the last 25 to 30 years, so basically the period since Big Bang, what's happened, I think, is that there's been a shift from the city being basically constituted by a number of people who were partners or entrepreneurs running their own organisations who expected in due course to pass on that organisation to their fellow partners and successors in some form or other, and were deeply concerned about its longevity and about the longevity of the whole system around them, and took a very big part in it. Those people now are managing directors in a division of a bank, and frankly, other than this year's bonus, we couldn't give a flying, as far as I can see, about the remainder of this. And those are the people who are basically constituting the major groups that are being portrayed as the voice.
Yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Tim?
Can I say something else which is perhaps a bit more personal? It's also about the people at the top. And let's just be clear, the people at the top of the Bank of England these days are not bankers, they're not from the city, they're actually mostly academics. And I certainly, by the two of them, they don't look the city at all, continued by the way Mervyn King. Mervyn King, I've known Mervyn King an awful long time. He doesn't like people in the private sector. And never has done. And so you've got people, and also, frankly, the kind of things that Lord Turner has said about the city, in my view, are astonishing. So you've got a problem if you are working in an organisation in the city that the people, the regulators and the people who are ultimately critical for the success of an organisation, they don't particularly empathise and support the traditional city and the city that's blossomed and grown over the last 30 or 40 years.
Thank you. Okay, the next question I'll take is from this gentleman here. Yes, sir.
Stephen Wolf, Financial Services spokesman for again, political party.
Speak up.
Okay, sorry, Stephen Wolf, Financial Services spokesman for UK. Members of this House, like Bill and Philip, the Bruges Group, have been very, very successful in pushing the message that we have to get out of Europe, along with, obviously, our own party. And we've got to the stage where, in our view, in our time, I believe that we will have a referendum, whether it's David Cameron's view or whether we had it before in a different way, whether it's even the Labour Party being forced into it if they win the next election. But from that, we notice that there will be an almighty battle, and there are going to be weaknesses that we face, the weaknesses of the press and the BBC, the weaknesses that meant much of the civil service in terms of the Foreign Office. Terry, you've raised the issue that many of the major bankers in the large organisations are going to be against us. So, in our view, when I'm looking at the weaknesses that we face, we have some strengths. It was a different time. We have a much more successful country. I think we have many of the politicians now are split about voting. We have businesses on small and medium size. But my question comes to the panel is that one of the key areas that we need to win is actually managing to persuade maybe the small and medium-sized businesses in the city, or indeed getting the law firms and accountancy side to actually step up to the plate and actually raise their head above the parapet like you have done, to actually suggest that we can put our names to letters in the Times and say, we feel there is a different economic model, because once out of the union, we can actually move forward to reducing our tax rates, to improving our regulation, and getting our business going. How do you feel that we can coagulate ourselves into a unified force where we can get these people on our side?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure whether we're going to be able to persuade lawyers, for instance. They're doing terribly well in many cases from the system that has risen up. Yeah. Roger, would you like to comment on this one?
Well, a few disparate comments. I very much agree with the objective of your remarks, that's to say how getting small and medium-sized businessmen in the city to come out openly on these issues. But I think the most important thing is actually the intellectual climate. I'm with Keynes, dare I say, on this. Powers of ideas, both good ones and bad ones, are in the end it's absolutely overwhelming. Yeah. I think we're winning the battle of ideas, actually. It's a slow process, but we're winning it. And with every ghastly development in the Eurozone, I think we're winning yet another skirmish in this long war. Now, for instance, in the BBC, which as we know has had a long Europhiliac bias for some considerable time, I do notice significant changes now. It's beginning to be understood, I think, pretty clearly that there is real pain in the Eurozone peripheral countries, that this is associated with the euro and it simply can't go on. I think the most important thing is actually getting the intellectual battle fought to a very, very high degree. And Tim, amongst many others, has made a major contribution here. I'm looking back to the case for staying out of the euro, with which I was actually quite closely involved, because I was involved with Business for Sterling on the council, and also David Owen's group, New Europe. You know, at the beginning, there was a widespread feeling of pessimism that if Blair wanted to take us into the euro, we were going to go into the euro. And I actually think the people who ran those organisations made a huge contribution to keeping us out, because they provided a lot of the key arguments. Now, of course, that alone wasn't enough, and Gordon Brown and Ed Balls had quite a lot to do with this. But the intellectual climate, making sure that goes our way, is, I think, absolutely fundamental.
Yes, it's weird to think that we've got to thank Gordon Brown in part for not being in the euro. One might speculate that his motivation was merely his dislike of the man who did want to be in the euro, but that would be speculation. Who knows? For all of that. Look, I'm fully supportive of what you're suggesting needs to occur. If you remember in my own remarks, I can't put it too strongly that I dislike intensely the representation from those who have a poll of 50 leading businessmen, and 68% of businesses in favour of being in the EU, which turns out, as I say, to be 34 people. I very much dislike the idea that those 34 people, who are deeply conflicted, frankly, in terms of their personal and their organisation's benefits, in some way are weighed as more important than 34 people that I encounter out there on the street. I don't take it, personally, as a point, that they are in some way better. That's why I think a referendum is a very important point. But frankly, how you organise the small and medium business lobby, or the people outside of those main business lobby, is something that's beyond my expertise. All I will say is, if you draft the letter, I'll sign it.
Thank you very much, Terry.
Perhaps at the start of this meeting, Barry should have warned you that I'm an economic spokesman and you do. And I just want to say something that may seem partisan, which is that I am bewildered that the three main political parties, we still call them the three main parties, I wonder how long it's going to continue, the three main political parties across the country support membership of the European Union without any real equivocation. And you come back to this question about why do people believe things. A lot of it is, it's partly because of what they believed in the past, and people changing opinion is difficult. And I also think that people like to become this involved with the future. 1930s people thought communism was the future. 1960s people thought European integration was the future. They carried on doing that in the 70s and 80s, and then they suddenly, someone like Kenneth Clark or Michael Heseltine, to realise that in fact they've been completely wrong. They have been completely wrong, frankly. It requires something. However, we are moving, and can I just say that the outcome of Eastleigh, I think, is going to shock people. Anyway, we'll find out, as I say, tomorrow night or Friday.
I'll take a question now from Sam Swerve.
Can I ask Terry Smith why it is, in his opinion, that the Conservative Parliamentary Party, almost without exception, gave tremendous support to David Cameron to announce that there would be a referendum, around 2017. Given that, he's trying to persuade the British public that he can repatriate funds. When he read the Maastricht Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty, he would know perfectly well that in accordance with the doctrine of acquis communautaire, it's virtually an impossibility unless all 27 countries give their support to it. And given also that Harold Wilson famously said a week in politics is a long time, well, what on earth is 5 years in politics which would be the earliest date for a referendum? And finally, with great respect, there's some conceit in the Conservative Party. They think they're going to have an overall majority at the next election, because in my opinion they're not.
Terry?
Yes, well, you will know from what I said earlier in my remarks that I am greatly sceptical that because somebody promises a referendum we're going to have one. So I'm certainly with you on that one. And not just remaining on that commitment because they don't happen to get re-elected either. It's been known for people to make other decisions when their feet hit the carpet in Whitehall in those circumstances. As for the applause from the Conservative Party, I mean you're closer than I am, perhaps, so you might be better able to judge it. But sadly, I'd like to conclude it's because they're Eurosceptic, but I actually conclude it's because they realise that the Her Majesty's opposition are so inept that it boxed them into a corner.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll now take one last question. I'll take a question from the young man in the blue shirt.
Thank you, sir. My name is Richard Palmer. You mentioned the future of the euro a few times, so I was just wondering if anyone in the panel wanted to make any predictions as to what the outcome of the euro crisis will be, whether it will or fall apart, or whether there's a political will to make something work.
Political will.
Roger, I think you've spent an awful lot of time thinking about this, so could you lead off?
Go on,
Yeah, the famed political will,
yes.
Which is undoubtedly there. I did say, actually, in my Telegraph column some time ago that no amount of political will is sufficient to enable you to reach the moon with a pea shooter. Political will is fundamental, but they've actually got to will the means, that's to say, the financial and institutional means. It is quite possible that the whole thing will hold together, and I agreed. Was it Tim? Someone said, we're dealing here with a religion. We are dealing with a religion, and they still believe it. So it is perfectly possible that, it seems to me, that they'll patch things up. However, I don't think it's very likely. The history of this whole affair has been one of problems coming and apparently going, and periods when everything's settled down and it's all tickety-boo. The latest of those, of course, followed Draghi's wonderful scheme to stabilise matters, all about buying bonds, and apparently the markets calmed down completely without Draghi having to buy a single bond. And he still hasn't bought a single bond. And the yields on Italian and Spanish debt fell dramatically in response to the Draghi plan, even though the Draghi plan laid down conditions which would explicitly not allow him to buy Italian and Spanish bonds until those countries submitting themselves to a euro bailout programme. So it's been quite bizarre, frankly, what's gone on. So I like to look at the fundamentals and concentrate on the fundamentals and ask myself, what has changed? What's improved? Well, there are some signs of improvement. Ireland is, I think, putting up a pretty good fist of working its way through all this. I don't detect much sign of improvement in Greece. Spain continues to look awful. Italy, we know, is mired in the most dreadful position, both economically and politically. I think the position of France is most interesting.
I agree.
Because not that long ago, the prevailing view, not least among the French, was that France was doing reasonably well and was securely attached to the German locomotive, or whatever you want to call it. And that's changed quite a lot over the last year. France's competitive position has deteriorated a lot. The demand position in France is awful. The labour market position is dreadful. I think Hollande has worsened all these structural difficulties by his tax and other policies, and it's begun to dawn on a lot of people that the position of France is pretty worrying, the fiscal position of France as well. So I don't know the answer to this, no one does know, but if you ask me the question, does it look as though the fundamentals have got better for the Eurozone, I would say no, I think they've got worse. And I believe in the fundamentals so strongly that I think ultimately one or other country is going to come out of this union.
Yeah. Going after Roger on that's never going to be a great spot, is it, really? Because I agree with just about everything he said, really. I would have said myself, political will is interesting, but money would be more useful. I I think it will. The euro will not persist. Why do I think the euro will not persist? I'm an analyst, basically, by training. I go back to my remarks earlier. It's not the only way you could look at this situation, but when you look at something which should never have been constructed in the first place, it's got a pretty high chance of not persisting. That's the first thing. Secondly, it looks to me as though there are any number of incidents that could occur that will cause the fracture. Almost certainly, if there is a fracture, by the way, I won't guess it, because it is almost always something that comes out of left field that hits you. Yeah. But, for example, it could be the Greek populist politicians that decide to leave. Why haven't they already? I always say to people, imagine if you're the Greeks, that there's a man sitting in front of you with a bag of money, and every time you make a promise, he hands over more money. Wouldn't you keep making promises till he's run out of money? I know I would. So that's the rough position that they're in. It's only when there is actually nothing more to be gained from the false promises that they might go, I think we'll leave. We've yet to reach that point. I think that the position in Spain is interesting. The Spanish banking system is in a dire situation. The combination of having more unsold housing units than the United States of America had at its peak. The combination of local authority-controlled banks with local authority-controlled planning and construction could produce some very interesting results in terms of misapplication of lending and corruption. Watch this space in terms of what comes out of it. We have already had, in effect, a creeping run on the Spanish banking system, which has stopped in the second half of last year after the Draghi remarks about whatever it takes, but could begin again at any point. And if those euro deposits start to leave Spain on the scale they were before, there is not enough money anywhere. So never mind your political will, including in Germany, to stop it up. At which point the only way for Spain to prevent that from continuing would be to impose some kind of capital controls to prevent money leaving it. Once you've got capital controls, I don't think you're truly in the euro anymore. If your euros are different to everybody else's euros, how does this work? So I think any or all of these are possible. I think that the France point is a thoroughly good one. France is, in fact, I think, a member of the periphery in almost every respect, masquerading as being Germany, sitting at the table dispensing advice and direction to the periphery as if it were Germany. No, it's not. It's actually, in many respects, in the most dire of situations, simply because it's not recognised. And finally, of course, last problem is Germany itself. Presumably at some point, somebody might mention to the German population that the continuation of this union will require them to make transfers to the periphery forever. And they might just balk at that. So I think there are any number of things, none of which is probably the one which will cause the fracture.
Great points, Terry. Roger's point about the Draghi put that never happened, it just reminds me of a famous saying of Keynes that markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. I think Tim has some comments.
Okay, I just wanted to say that Star Barry McGrath have been right on every key public policy issue in economics for 30, 40 years, which of course is true in essence, but only in essence, because I'm afraid I've been wrong on the euro. I didn't expect the euro to get started because I thought that there were fundamental features of any viable long-run monetary union that simply hadn't been included in the plans. And I just say that although I was wrong about that, all the work I wrote was absolutely brilliant. But then I've also, in the last few years, been asked this question many times, including at Bruges group meetings. When will the euro break up? And I think I've given dates, and so far I've been wrong. However, it is going to break up. And can I just, before I finish, just make, I think, an analytical point which isn't yet, I think, really, and I think it's quite important, which is that what's happening in places like Greece is that they're having a very severe downturn in the economy on a cyclical basis. Economists would normally think that won't affect the long-run ability of the economy to produce. The economy will eventually bounce back, there'll be stronger balance of payments, the external creditors will pay, and so on. But that's not what's going on. What's going on is that in Greece, young people can't find jobs. Businessmen can't make money if they make investments. And therefore, the people are leaving Greece, able people are leaving Greece, capital is leaving Greece, and so on. The ability to produce is therefore being reduced. It's being made worse by the attempts to balance the budget because they push taxes up. What's happening is the economy, the ability to produce is going down. That undermines the tax base. to pay the external debts, they actually need more tax revenue to pay the interest on the debts. But they push taxes up, and then more young people leave, more businessmen take their capital out, and reduce the ability of the economy to produce. And even if Terry said it's correct, they're being bribed to stay in, oh no, this is completely unsustainable. If you're destroying the ability of your economy to produce, you are in this endgame. And the same thing is going on all over the periphery. People are leaving the periphery to go to Germany. They're destroying the tax base, destroying the ability to service external debts being, that built up in the past. This must break down.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. I'm now going to wind the meeting up. I'd just like to begin by thanking David Nuttall for actually booking this room for us. I'd also just like to come back on Tim. I did say, Tim, that you've been right about nearly every major issue, and you quite rightly and modestly drew attention to the fact that you were wrong in that you didn't believe these people could be crazy enough to bring in the euro. And that actually reminds me of a meeting that we had in this room, I think it was about some 18 years ago, Tim, when you said that they won't be crazy enough to do this, and they can't fix the markets to do this. And people like myself and Bill Cash over there were saying, well, we've met some of these guys, and they are crazy enough to do this. Bill and I made warnings in the chamber, 18 years ago, predicting exactly what was going to be happening now. But we're very, very pleased that we have had a panel and we have got people of such preeminence and expertise to put these arguments forward now, because we really do need their help, support and advocacy if we're going to win this referendum whenever it may come. And unless we have their support, and unless they are in a prominent position and making these eloquent arguments, these practical arguments that we have heard tonight, unless that happens, we will fail, and Britain will never be a state again in the way that we would like it to be. So thank you tonight for our panel, and also thank you for what you may do for us in the future. Thank you.